All right, so ghettos. The first thing that I want to talk about as far as ghetto goes or ghettos go is that fact that usually these days people say the word ghetto and it's something that we make fun of. I want you to not think about a ghetto as you know it now or what ghetto means because where it comes from is a pretty big place of hatred. It comes back to placing Jews in confined spaces so the rest of the city, country, etc. didn't have to deal with them and be around them. So in we're not quite to World War II yet, but in this process that Hitler is going through, as far as trying to get rid of the Jews from major cities, he creates these ghettos. A ghetto is a pretty confined space within a town. If we think about Evansville, like in the sense of looking down on it, it would be taking a very small section of houses that are really close to each other. In this sense, it was kind of like almost apartment buildings, and shoving everybody into that really small space. So ghettos were not something that Jews necessarily wanted to live in. The first groups that were put into ghettos, they're forced out of their houses. And it's an instance of even when Jews are forced out of their houses, because a lot of them had really nice places. Germans just went in and took over their houses. It's kind of like a first come, first served basis. Or if you were a military family, you might get to move into that Jewish house. You took their whatever belongings they left. The house, it was just theirs all of a sudden. So ghettos, if you take a look at the picture, they're surrounded by brick walls, barbed wire. Lots of times there was even glass on top. It was meant to keep Jews in and to keep everybody else out. Okay. The first one that we're going to talk about is Lotz. In 1940, there's 230,000 Jews put into the Lotz ghetto. There's more than 3 people per room. It's not like a room in a house where you've got lots of people in a place, but it's a room that people are living in. The Lotz ghetto, they're all, most of them are all pretty popular. This one's a big one. But in the Lotz ghetto, of that 230,000 people, I believe only 12 children survived that ghetto. I can talk to you about that in a little bit, but ghettos are really disease rampant. Nobody's there to take care of them. It's unsanitary. They don't have automatic toilets or water at this time. People died there because it was dirty. They were crammed into small spaces. The rest of people who didn't die there were transported out to concentration camps, which we'll start to talk about. 877 people total survived the Lotz ghetto, which means either they did not die within the ghetto or they were not transported out. That was the last group there. Like I said, 12 children survived. All right. Here are some pictures. So this is a really popular picture, famous picture. It's called Boys with His Hands Up. You can see these soldiers in the background pointing guns at people. It was very, very scary being put into a ghetto and then getting transitioned to concentration camps. Soldiers were not kind at all with it. These children down here probably don't have any parents. You are never guaranteed to make it into a ghetto or a concentration camp with your family. These kids are probably Romani just by or gypsies by the way that they look. They're begging for food, except there was no food. In the ghetto, people, Jews were rationed food, and they had to work very, very hard to even get a ration of food. This picture of these horses, these are buggies. Basically, they would come through each day and pick the dead bodies up off of the streets and throw them into the back of these buggies and take them out of the ghetto. So this video, I'm just going to turn the volume down and I'll read it to you, is about 2 different people who lived in the ghetto and their experience. We got a loaf of bread for 8 days. But people finished it in 2 days, and then what? I walked around with a stick with a nail stuck on the end. A truck with potatoes passed outside the ghetto. I ran after the truck and caught potatoes with my stick. I caught one potato and another potato and came home with food for lunch. We were thieves. We had to produce and work hard to earn our food and rations, and we did work hard. Someone who was hungry wrote, "We'll eat rose and butter in the ghetto." It was an impossible fantasy. We got a loaf of bread and 20 grams of coffee. You couldn't live on that. That's why people collapsed in the streets and died. Died. Many died in the ghettos. A family with a girl named Hanechka lived on my street. She was very sick. She had tuberculosis. She was all skin, bones, and eyes. I loved her very much, and I paid her a visit. Before I left, her mother told me that she asks for nothing. She doesn't ask for food. She doesn't cry. And she asked everyone who came to kiss her. Everyone kissed her, and then she died. My father's mother was in the Lotz ghetto. He told me, "Go to your grandma and bring her some soup." I went, and when I arrived, I saw my grandmother lying in bed. I said, "Grandma, I brought you some soup." But Grandma wasn't alive. The first thing I did was look under her pillow, where I found half a loaf of bread. I sat down, finished half a loaf of bread, and went home. I said, "Grandma is dead." It was forbidden to go out, and every house would be inspected. They got to my street and building. We were told that the Germans had arrived, and that we were to go down to the yard and stand in a row to undergo the selection. I can't describe how afraid I was for my mother. I only remember trying to make her look pretty and young. I pinched her cheeks a little to make her look lively, to make her look like a person capable of working. We stood in the yard and the selection began. Whoever went in one direction went to the trucks. Whoever went in the opposite direction ran away. My mother and I safely passed the selection and fled. We ran into a building and hugged each other. We were so thrilled. I can't describe how happy we were. So that gives you a little bit of an idea about what the ghettos were like. They didn't have food. They were dirty. They were unsanitary. Jews were forced to move into them, and they didn't really have a choice. So, as you heard that woman just describe, they were something called the selection. Oftentimes selections happened where Nazis would select which people would be able to make it to the concentration camps or which would not be able to make it to the concentration camps. So there were about 20,000 concentration camps in total. They were divided into two different types of camps, death camps and work camps. Some camps were a combination of both. So a death camp usually consisted of a camp that had crematoriums, or Jews were sent to die. A work camp was filled with different types of things that Jews could be doing. Jews were cheap, free labor. They didn't have to pay them. They didn't have to worry about them. If they died, it didn't matter. So some work camps worked Jews beyond the point of being able to survive. It could be being in mines, digging for different types of materials. It could be factory work. It could have been work to help the Germans get ahead as far as the war efforts went. Work could also be something as stupid as having them move rocks from one place to another. Work camps could have also been giving Jews the jobs to continue to build more barracks or places for the Jews to sleep, buildings in those concentration camps. So when we start to think about these camps, it really was a place for Jews to go, and if they died, they died. Many of them died in concentration camps. They died from starvation. They were not fed. They had very, very minimal food. Most of the time their food was rotten. Anything that was left over from the soldiers was given to them. Usually it was bread. Maybe they would get soup that had rotten vegetables in the bottom. But many of them died from starvation. If you'll see some pictures today in this slide, but if you look up pictures of Holocaust survivors or Jews during the Holocaust, you will be able to see them skin and bones that they definitely died of starvation. The next one is exposure and exhaustion. In the next slide, we'll go through what like a typical day at a camp looked like, but exposure. So Germany, or I should just kind of say Europe in general, has a very similar climate to like what we have in Wisconsin. So they were not provided with sufficient clothes or blankets or those types of things to keep them warm. Sometimes they didn't even have shoes, or they didn't have pants, or clothes didn't fit. So I want you to think about, like, in the winter time, not having appropriate gear outside, your body is not going to react well to that. As far as exhaustion goes, they were worked from beginning of the day to the end of the night. Sometimes they were kept up purposefully to just stand in rows. And so they're not sleeping. People are sick. There's tons of diseases. We've got typhoid. Lice is terrible. You've got tons of sick people with a lot of diseases that spread. So gas chambers, this might be like a death camp. A gas chamber, sometimes people would get off these train cars as they're brought into concentration camps. If they don't pass a selection, they're put into a gas chamber. They lock the door and they dropped Zyklon B down in the top. And this was basically like a gas that just killed everybody. Most of the time they came up with a way to make these Jews go in willingly, because they didn't want to fight. They didn't want to waste their bullets. Their bullets were too valuable for them to have to kill the Jews. So they were dirty. They had probably been on a train car for many, many days. I think I'll talk about that in a little bit too. But most of the time the Nazis say, strip down, take your clothes off, know where you're putting all of your things, know where your belongings are. We're going to give you a shower. You guys stink. You're dirty. You're gross. And when you feel dirty and stinking gross and someone offers you a shower, most of the time you go along with it. So that's another way that they got them into gas chambers. Other side from medical experiments, again, Jews were seen as animals. They weren't people. They didn't matter. There was one doctor who actually would look purposefully for twins to perform medical experiments on them. Crazy things from like, if I inject this color into this twin's eye, will the eyes change colors? If I cut this limb off and sew it onto the twin, will the twin be able to take that limb on? Injected them with different types of medications and things so that there was always like a one twin that didn't have anything done, and to see what happened. I can't think of what that's called in science. But no medical experiment that came out of any of that actually has ever been used for anything. So stupid. It's just stupid. So here are some different pictures. Like I said, you can see on their legs just how skinny they are, in their faces, in their rib cages, and look at the clothes that they have. they really don't have great clothes. This saying is on a lot of concentration camps. Arbeit macht frei. It means work will set you free. So the harder you work, the more likely you are to get free, which we know is obviously not true. This is a barracks. A barracks is where they sleep. It's basically like a shed. And you can see many men sleep to one platform. These are bowls. They didn't have pillows or blankets. If you had a bowl, you were really lucky because you could get food from it. Most of them carried them with them so that they didn't get stolen. So here are some more pictures of camps. Again, here's some men labeled with something. So I don't know what this sign means, but they're a group of people. This might be like a work camp or at a concentration camp. They would often have Jews dig big grave holes so that they could throw dead Jews in them. That's a picture down here. This is bodies of Jews who've been thrown into a pile. They would do crazy things. They'd have them dig holes, and then maybe they'd make them all get into the holes, and then they would kill them. So they were basically digging their own graves. This is a picture of a crematorium. They would throw dead bodies in here and start them on fire because it was an easy way to get rid of them, just to burn them. The other thing, this is a pile of shoes. Usually when Jews came into a concentration camp, they were stripped of every belonging that they had. Wedding rings, gold teeth, shoes, any type of jewelry. If they had anything valuable on them, it was taken. So let's see if we can click this. Oh, this one doesn't work. Never mind. All right. So let me just kind of see where we're at. Child victims. This is where it starts to get heavy, and this is where it's hard to not be in school with you guys to kind of walk through the craziness of all of this. Children were seen as easily disposable to the Nazis. They didn't want children because they couldn't work. If their parents were capable of working, it would take up their time. It put a damper on things. This would have been the next generations of Jews, and they didn't want Jews. They didn't want Jews reproducing or getting married or having any of those types of things. So they got rid of that generation first. So we can see these children standing in lines with their parents. This is a cattle car. Oftentimes they were forced into these cattle cars. So it's like a train car, except most of the time they've got a little window up here. They would ride in these train cars for days. They were packed until there was no more space. Cliche, but packed like sardines, literally. People would die standing up in place. People would go to the bathroom standing in place because you couldn't move. You couldn't get out. They didn't have water. It was scary. So here's a picture of wedding rings. Here's dead bodies stacked on top of each other. But child victims, there were many. just realized I probably should have read that to you since it was in cursive. Sorry. All right. So typical day in a concentration camp. Oftentimes, Jews were woken up at 4 o'clock a.m. In order to make their bed, although they had nothing to make their bed with, and do roll call. There was one bathroom for about 400 people. Outhouse, hole in the ground, basically was what it was. An outhouse probably would have been nicer. So about 400 Jews would share one outhouse, one bathroom, one hole in the wall. They didn't have chances to wash. It was dirty. It was filthy. They didn't shower. They didn't get to wash their hands. They didn't get to wash their faces. They didn't have any of those types of necessities. So they woke up really early for roll call. So roll call basically is the way that the Nazis are able to keep track of all of the Jews. Most of the time in these camps, they have a number tattooed on their arm, and they're called by number, which is another way to take away that like humanity of a person. They don't have names anymore. This way, during roll call, Nazis could see who died in the middle of the night, who tried to escape, if they needed to punish somebody, how people looked, if that person needed to go through a selection and be taken to the next step, which meant to probably be killed. So that roll call happened pretty early in the morning. They got 10 ounces of bread, which is usually moldy, and something called coffee, which is usually like water with dirt in the bottom to make it brown, or very, very minimal coffee actually in it. 10 ounces of bread is not a lot of food. That's a day, maybe, if they got that much. So they work 12 to 14 hours a day. It's usually pointless work. It's difficult. And now think of trying to eat 10 ounces of bread, doing 12 to 14 hours of work a day. Your body is obviously going to quickly become malnourished. They don't get lunch. And then again, there's another evening roll call. Supper is some type of soup. Like I said earlier, usually it's like water with maybe some vegetables in the bottom, usually rotten vegetables. However, you want it to be the last in line because that's where all of the vegetables fall to, is the bottom. So regardless if they are rotten, most people still wanted to eat it because it was something of some type of nutritional value. If they didn't have a bowl, they would hold their hands out, and they'd get their food this way, and this is how they would have to eat. So again, if you're trying to eat soup, you're going to lose a lot through your hands. So they're really not getting food. Most people slept 6 to 8 per twin size bed. They don't have blankets. They don't have heat. They're really treated like animals. So here are some camp photos. Fingers crossed this link works. No, guys, they all worked last year. I checked most of them before I started this, but I guess they changed it all on me. I'll find some, and I'll post some links up on Google Classroom so that you can look at some besides the ones that I'm trying to show you here. Fingers crossed. Oh, yay, this one works. Okay. So these photos, this is kind of after the war is over. Okay. So this is Germans are confronting the Nazi atrocities, which means after World War II ends, people always say, like, how could German citizens realize like this was going on in their backyards, this was going on in their communities, this was going on right outside of their towns, and not understand how bad it actually was. So like I said, after everything was over, Germans were forced to go and look at this to say, like, hey, this was part of you not stepping up and saying that these things weren't okay. So this is SS officer Eichendorfer, the commandant of this concentration camps. He's standing among the corpses of prisoners killed in his camps. This German girl, we can see all of these Germans are walking past these bodies. She's overcome as she walks past them. Some of the 800 slave workers were murdered by the SS guards near Nijmegen, Germany. The townspeople were made and forced to look. This is a death train. Okay. So a death train usually was a train that happened at the end of the war when Germany was starting to realize that they were starting to lose the war. They would put Jews from concentration camps on these death trains for the purpose of they're probably going to die here, but then they're not going to make it if our camp ends up getting exposed by one of the other countries fighting against us. So it's American soldiers of the U.S. 7th Army Force, believed to be Hitler Youth. These are Hitler Youth. They're examining boxcars of bodies of prisoners that were starved to death. German civilians under U.S. military escort are forced to see a wagon loaded with corpses in Buchenwald, which is a concentration camp. These are mass graves of people underneath. German civilians from the town of Nordhausen dig mass graves for dead prisoners in the Nordhausen concentration camp. Orders from the U.S. Army, Austrian citizens remove corpses from the Russian camp. So the United States really tried to show German citizens what they did was wrong and to make them do some of the things that they probably wouldn't have chosen to do. Here's a crematorium. Again, civilians are being forced by American soldiers to see what the crematoriums looked like. Under the direction of the American soldier, German civilians from Gardendelgen carry wooden crosses to the site where they were ordered to bury bodies of concentration camp prisoners. All right. So now we're gonna move. This is a really hard line to now move over to the other side. However, like I said, I'll post up some other things as Mr. Wimmer and I go through this unit with you. We're going to try to give you lots of different types of sites to look at or articles to read to help you start to wrap your head around just the kind of the atrocity of World War II and the Holocaust. The other thing too is as you're reading books and we're going to do a read aloud called Night by Elie Wiesel. He actually is one of the most famous survivors of the Holocaust. It'll start to make a little bit more sense when you can hear other characters' stories rather than just me going through this Google Slides. So most of us, when we probably think of World War II, think of Pearl Harbor, think about the attack in Hawaii on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese. So we as Americans fought on two fronts. We fought in Europe on that front, and then we fought on our front with Japan. We didn't really want to get involved in any war in the first place, so we'll kind of segue into both of these. So Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, 7:55 a.m. to 9:45 a.m., the Japanese have a surprise attack. It's a Sunday. Sunday is a day of rest. People are not working. We've got a lot of soldiers and nurses and civilians pretty early in the morning just hanging out at home, not really expecting anything to happen. The United States and Japan actually had been on in a peace trial. They were in a peace treaty. So as far as America knew, nothing between Japan and the United States was wrong. So this attack was absolutely a surprise in Pearl Harbor on America when it happened. So like I said, a surprise attack. It came in two waves. The first wave comes through, and it destroys 164 planes. It damages 128, and it takes out our naval base. Okay, all of our ships that are in the harbor. So at this point, because it's that surprise attack and it takes out planes and our Navy, we don't really have anything to really good fight back. 2,335 people are killed. 68 of them are civilians. 1,178 people are wounded. And usually in time of war, when we've got soldiers fighting against each other, civilians are usually, for the most part, kept out of it. Okay. So that was something that was a little bit different at this point. The next day, President Roosevelt declares war on Japan. So here are some pictures, or a picture. This is our naval base. Japan's planes flew in and bombed from up above. They dropped bombs in the water. They dropped bombs on top. And so that's where things are start to come apart. This is the USS Arizona. This is the monument that's on top. There are still bodies trapped in this to this day that weren't able, soldiers that weren't able to get out. All right, I think we've got pictures on here somewhere. Not unless my thing changed on me again. Yeah, guys, they changed their links. Oh, maybe this is what I was looking for. All right, here we go. Pearl Harbor. We'll just go through some pictures so that you can see again. So Japanese torpedo bombers flew 50 feet above the water. They fired at U.S. ships in the harbor, and other planes staffed the decks with bullets and bombs. This is some burning wreckage. We've got airplanes that are on fire at the naval station. Smoke rises from burning buildings on Ford Island. Running for cover, a sailor runs for cover past flaming wreckage, hit by dive bombers that had already blasted Pearl Harbor. The USS California and USS Oklahoma with smoke pouring out of their battleships. Here's the USS Arizona exploding after the attack. Life preserver. Japanese forces trained for about a year to prepare for this attack. The Japanese attack force, which included 6 aircraft carriers and 420 planes, sailed from Hitokapu Bay in the Kuril Islands on a 3,500-mile voyage to a staggering area 230 miles off the Hawaiian island of Oahu. Image from above, battleships in flames. A U.S. Plane hit. Battleship starting to be destroyed. 2 servicemen sit on wreckage of a bomber surrounded by dirt and sandbags after the attack. Japanese torpedo plane that was shot down. A mass grave dug after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. All right. All right, so here's one thing that's not often talked about. What we had happen in America after the bombing of Pearl Harbor is not something that's taught often in history classes or at all, but what we did as America was pretty terrible. So Pearl Harbor is attacked Pearl Harbor is attacked by Japan. America gets really scared of anybody in the United States who is Japanese or Japanese American because of how they look. What happened was after the attack on Pearl Harbor, anybody who was of Japanese descent in the United States, even if they were 100% American citizen, had been born here, they were taken from their homes, told that they had not a lot of time to pack up, maybe 24 hours to grab as many belongings as they could, and they were going to be moved to internment camps, which were kind of like concentration camps, except they weren't being treated as badly as the way Jews were. Okay, so they weren't being forced to work, or they weren't not given certain necessities. 120,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans who were living in the United States were imprisoned. 2/3 of those 120,000 people were American citizens. Half of them were children or babies. So I said 24 hours. It was between 24 and 48 hours to pack. If they could sell their house, sell their house. You can only take what you can carry. Most of these Japanese citizens, American citizens or Japanese American citizens, were living on the West Coast. So California, Oregon, Washington, and America was scared of these people because they were so close to the water. And what kind of went through the president's head, the reason that they were told to be imprisoned and moved out, is because they were afraid that they were going to help Japan out and ultimately bring down America. None of them were convicted for spying on Japan. None of them. They were all innocent. They were all white people who actually were convicted for spying on Japan after the aftermath of finding everything out. There are some super good books. There's one that I just read. I gotta think of the name. George Taki. He was like the guy on Star Trek. He just came out with a graphic novel about his experience with his family and him being in the Japanese internment camps. It's so good. I'll put that book up on Google Classroom. All right, so next thing, Allied versus Axis powers. So the major Allied forces, Allied means the group that comes together. So we're talking about America. It's the United States, England, France, Soviet Union, and China in World War II. The major Axis forces, Germany, Italy, and Japan. Okay. So, like I said, we did not, as America, as a country, want to get started in the fight in Europe. We waited a really long time before we had to go over to help our allies fight the war that was happening overseas. So you might have heard of the Battle of D-Day. It is actually called the Battle of Normandy, the official title. And what this was it was the combined effort between the United States, Canada, and England. This was to fight to start taking back against the Nazis, to start getting their ground back. Basically, Germany at this point had expanded so far and taken over those different countries in Europe that this was our effort to help those countries get their land back. So 160,000 troops went for the Battle of Normandy. There were 30,000 vehicles. It was a 50-mile stretch of the French coastline that we as Allied forces wanted to take back over. And so what we did is we had code names for this stretch of coastline. Utah, Omaha, Gold, Junos, and Sword. They were the beaches, the points that our Allied forces were going to take on from water. There were a ton of losses. There were 9,000 plus Allied casualties. And a casualty doesn't necessarily mean dead. It could be to be injured in any way. This video does a really good job of explaining D-Day and the Battle of Normandy. If it works. Oh, it's right here, guys. Duh.
All right, who's next? And ask Gina anything.
John McGivern here. Gina, how can folks save with Pella Windows and Doors of Wisconsin?
Replacing old leaky windows and doors with new ones from Pella can really help those utility bills. And right now, save more with 0 APR 60-month financing and no payments for 5 months.
Are you really Gina Della from Pella?
Let's just say it's a wedding gift from my husband that I really come to love. Visit PellaWI.com today.
After months of preparation and deception, Eisenhower launches his attack against German-occupied France. 150,000 ground troops jammed onto hundreds of small landing craft leave England and cross the English Channel. They'll land at 5 different beaches in France, codenamed Juno, Sword, Gold, Utah, and Omaha. As the landing craft approach the beaches, 15,000 aircraft and 7,000 ships provide a coordinated aerial assault on the beaches. At some of the landing sites, the Allied soldiers meet very little resistance. But at beaches like Omaha, it's hell on earth. For many of the Allied soldiers inside the landing craft, these moments before the door opens will be their last.
A case of incredible courage in the face of overwhelming horror. I mean, if you think about it, the landing crafts came up to the beach, and as they came up to the beach, the troops inside the landing craft could hear the machine guns tattering on the outside. The enemy machine guns switched to what they call FCL, Final Coordination Line. They're going to put as much machine gun fire on the front of that boat, so when it drops, bullets go right through it, kill 2 or 3 guys at a time. A lot of guys just died that way.
Many don't make it off the boats. For the soldier lucky enough to survive the initial machine gun barrage, the nightmare is just beginning. He then has to cross 200 yards of mined tidal flats, weighed down with wet, heavy gear. Then get through another 100 yards of barbed-wired beaches. It's 3 football fields of death and destruction as German machine guns shred fellow soldiers and friends.
If you ever get a chance to visit Omaha, it will change your whole view about the world. It will change your whole view about America. It will make you realize what incredible heroism was displayed by those guys there.
The Allies survive on death ground by fighting together and never giving up.
Putting an army in a situation where it must fight or die. And they fought. And they fought well, and they survived.
Through bravery and determination, the troops are able to take all 5 landing sites at Normandy.
Despite all of the complex planning that went into the invasion of Normandy, it was the small unit tactics and the buddies fighting side by side that wins the Battle of the Beaches, and that's consistent throughout history.
All right, so that's your example of the Battle of Normandy. So now we're going to go back to Japan and talk about the atomic bombs. So the United States and Japan are continuing to fight, and President Harry S. Truman basically says, we're going to drop this atomic bomb on you if you don't retreat, if you don't surrender in the war. And Japan refused. So on August 6, 1945, Little Boy was dropped on Hiroshima, and this was the first atomic bomb that was dropped. From the initial blast, 70,000 Japanese died from the initial blast of the atomic bomb being dropped. Less than 10% of buildings suffered 0 damage, so almost everything that was dropped on Hiroshima was damaged. After 5 years, 200,000 plus people were dead due to radiation and the aftermath of the atomic bomb. Japan still refused to surrender after Little Boy was dropped. So if you guys take a look at this picture up here, there's very few buildings that are left standing. Everything was wiped out. All right, let's see if this one works over here. I'm gonna have to click out of it to get it to work.
Having ignored American demands for surrender, the Japanese were now to experience the effects of a new weapon of destruction. Atom bombs were to be dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japanese reported, suddenly a glaring light appeared in the sky. In seconds, thousands of people were scorched by a wave of searing heat. Many were killed instantly. Others lay writhing on the ground, screaming in agony. By evening, the fire began to die down, and then it went out. There was nothing left to burn. Hiroshima had ceased to exist. The bomb had heralded in a new and terrible concept of warfare, but its use probably saved hundreds of thousands of both American and Japanese lives, for the fighting was over.
Ah, one of these days, you guys, I'm gonna learn. All right. All right, so they did not surrender after the first atomic bomb. Okay, wasn't good enough for Japan. So a couple days later, August 9th, 1945, Nagasaki, which is another city in Japan, was hit by the bomb called Fat Man. It actually was hit off target. So the Americans who were dropping the bomb dropped it in the wrong spot. If they would have dropped it in the right spot, the damage would have been even more devastating than it already was in Nagasaki. 70,000 people were dead within a year. The 5-year death toll racked up to about 140,000 people. And after this atomic bomb, Japan finally surrenders. So again, you can see in these pictures how everything is really flattened out.
abcmouse.com is so fun. There's
And we were on that bomb run for three and a half minutes. Tom and I are talking.
Christ, Dutch, never sat on a bomb run this long over Germany. They'd have blasted us out the sky. Yeah.
He said, nothing there. No opposition, no nothing. Right there. Just, just going to bomb the target.
I saw an aircraft, like a tiny silver drop, entering the sky above Hiroshima. I instantly recognized it as an American plane, as no Japanese aircraft could fly at that altitude at the time. It was just one plane, so I assumed that it was passing by as usual. I was content. Ichi-ni-san.
I was wiping the desktop. That was when the bomb was dropped. Ne.
It took about 45 seconds from the time the bomb left the airplane until it exploded. And I think there wasn't a man in the airplane that wasn't either timing it with his watch or counting or doing something. I was sure the bomb was a dud. I was sure it wasn't going to work.
going for 43 seconds, the time and barometric triggers started the firing mechanism. A uranium bullet fired down a barrel into a uranium target. Together, they started a nuclear chain reaction. Solid matter began to come apart, releasing untold quantities of energy.
At 1-800-CONTACTS, we're here for people like...
Oh, yeah, quiet, please. All right. All right. That is the end of everything that we're going to cover. Again, this was a super brief overview of what we're going to go through in this unit. So if you did not finish your last 5 things that were interesting to you, make sure that you write something down. And then get that sheet turned into Google Classroom, okay? If you have questions, please feel free to email Mr. Wimmer or myself. We'll continue to put up some links and stuff as we go so that you've got all different, hi. You've got all different kinds of information kind of coming at you.
Mom, where'd you